He's mostly wrong here, but there is a tiny kernel of truth, so let's go ahead and watch it and we'll talk about it step by step.
Next is easily understandable universal, including the abolishment of motion inputs. I've argued with people about this in the past, and quite frankly, I'm done being patient with this argument. Motion inputs are an ancient relic of fighting games, and they're just simply not needed for any balancing reason at all.
So that's the big hot take that got everybody upset and had him on screw-up quotes and everything else. And that's mostly because he's making the arguments that motion inputs need to go away completely, and of course that's not true. Motion inputs exist for two main reasons. For starters, it gives the characters a wider range of inputs for their move list, and this means the character is more unique. Having more moves gives them more personality. Because without motion inputs, the developers are limited to just a single button or a combination of button presses, and you run out of ideas pretty quick. And that's why certain games like Phantasy Strike and Rising Thunder do tend to have very small move lists for each character. And you could argue this does make the characters easier to play, and that is true, but it also means less depth, so players don't stick around that long because eventually they learn the characters and they move on. Reason number 2 for motion inputs is it makes moves that are a bit too strong to be a normal attack a bit tougher to do on reaction. So for example, Ryu's Shoryuken. In past games, this move was fully invincible, it's a great anti-air, and it does good damage. So if all of that was possible with a single button, it would be way too strong. And that's why in Phantasy Strike there is a character with a Shoryuken attack, but it actually does damage to her every time she uses it. But if you ask me, that's a bit too extreme. It's much easier to just make it a motion input instead, because now that move that's a bit too strong to be a regular attack with just one button is a bit tougher to do on reaction. However, thankfully most motion inputs are not tough to do at all. In summary, the reason a super move has a more difficult input in a lot of fighting games is so you can't do it on a moment's notice to punish absolutely anything, at least not without practicing a bunch. And then on top of that, this move also becomes tougher to do under pressure. If you and the opponent are both very low on life and the opponent makes a mistake and you barely catch it, maybe you can't do that input in time. And once again, that's by design. It's supposed to be something tough to pull off under pressure, which is why it's a bit more complicated than the other typical inputs.
Would not argue for this in any other genre. I'm not even going to pretend that there's a reasonable argument for motion inputs as a base core design.
This point right here is honestly the weakest one in his entire argument. The idea that no other genre has motion inputs is like me playing a fighting game and complaining that I can't scope in. There's no reason to scope in a fighting game. You don't have to aim at the character in that way from a first-person perspective. So of course a first-person shooter isn't going to have motion inputs. However, a first-person shooter is a good example here, because while the player does handle most weapons the same, there are certain guns that are stronger than others, and as a result they have restrictions on them. For example, a sniper rifle in Call of Duty requires you to scope in to get an accurate shot, whereas most regular guns can be fired from the hip and they're still pretty accurate. And the reason the sniper rifle can't do that is because the damage is so high. It kills most players in a single shot. And as a result, that gun requires you to scope in. Even if you quickscope, it still requires a special level of skill to use effectively, otherwise it would be way too strong. And the same can also be said for a rocket launcher in Halo. The rocket launcher has a huge area of impact and does a ton of damage. And since in most Halo games your character moves very slowly, it's very easy to kill you with that weapon, and as a result it travels very slowly. Which is actually not true to how most RPGs behave in real life. They travel very quickly, but in Halo you move very slowly, and the move does a ton of damage, has a big area of impact, so it has to travel slowly or it wouldn't be fair. And even the Spartan laser is a great example of this. It does a ton of damage and kills pretty much everything in its path, but it has to charge for a good time before it fires.
Hey pal, you just blowing from Stupid Town?
One final thing I do want to touch on that I forgot to mention earlier, and I'm kind of face-palming for that, is that Street Fighter V, a very popular mainstream fighting game, already has characters without motion inputs. You have Ed, and you also have Falk. Both of these characters don't rely on motion inputs for the most part. Instead, you have multiple buttons that are used for their special moves. And for me personally, that was actually tougher than a command input because it was so different. It just felt weird for me and very alien. But I imagine for a casual player, it wasn't that tough to make the adjustment. And I will admit that just pressing 2 buttons to do an invincible Shoryuken is way easier than trying to do a Dragon Punch. And the same was also true for the anti-airs. It's pretty much impossible to jump on Falk or Ed if the player knows what they're doing, because they can react on a dime and just boom, 2 buttons, pow, anti-air. And the reason I bring those characters up is they do not have a cooldown, so no motion inputs, but also nothing else to really compensate for it. And even so, those characters aren't considered absurdly OP. I don't think so. I know Ed's definitely not top tier. He was terrible, and now I think he's middle tier, maybe barely above middle tier. And I think Falk is a bit above that, but I don't think she's top 10 or top 5, but it's been a very long time since I played Street Fighter, but she is better than Ed. So as you can see right there, we have 2 characters in a mainstream fighting game without any motion inputs, so this guy wasn't completely wrong, and that's why I made this video. He's wrong for the most part, but he's not wrong completely.